Buonasera a tutti, good evening and welcome to the Italian Radio Hour. Io sono Viviana and I would like to welcome back our regular listeners and also welcome any new listeners and anyone listening online at khbradio.com. Also, be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at the Italian Radio Hour and subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch up on any past episodes. Vorrei dare il benvenuto ai nostri ascoltatori da tutto il mondo. Grazie per essere con noi anche oggi mentre continuiamo il nostro viaggio per l'Italia e la cultura italiana. Last week, we had a very interesting conversation with a young man from Italy, Andrea Franzoni, who is soon embarking on a cross-country bike trip, 11 states, 600 kilometers, to retrace the places where his grandfather, Aldo Arrighi, was held as a POW between 1943 and 1946. We then continued the conversation with documentary director Michael Di Lauro, who presented his work, Prisoners Among Us. Tonight, we'll switch gears a little bit and we'll dive into the food scene of ancient Rome with archaeologist, baker, and food writer Farrell Monaco, whose research centers on food waste, food preparation, and food-related ceramics in the Roman Mediterranean. But before we get to our guest tonight, let's find out the answer to last week's trivia question. What is the meaning of chi ha il pane non ha denti, chi ha denti non ha pane? Well, if you're trying to translate it literally, who has bread doesn't have teeth, and who has teeth doesn't have bread. So this is an expression that we use often to refer to a situation. Maybe someone has the skill but doesn't have the means, or people that once they say people that have money but don't have time to travel, and once they have time to travel, maybe they might not have money. So you just it's very used, and you will see why I chose this proverb for today's episode. But before bringing our first guest on, a little bit of pubblicità. Do you want to learn, improve, or master your Italian? Istituto Mondo Italiano can help. Located in the heart of Regent Square, Mondo Italiano offers small group classes and one-on-one private tutoring to help you learn Italian in no time. Visit us online at www.istitutomondoitaliano.org. Well, welcome back, everyone. I am super excited to introduce tonight's guest, Farrell Monaco. Farrell is an archaeologist and food writer whose research centers on food waste, food preparation, and food-related ceramics in the Roman Mediterranean. In recent years, she has worked as a team member on Roman food archaeology projects at CEIPA, the University of Barcelona, at Monte Testaccio, Rome, Italy, and the Pompeii Food and Drink Project in Naples, Italy. Both long-term projects have provided critical data and insight into classical Roman economy, politics, food waste, and cultural identity. Taking Rome food archaeological data one step further, Farrell is well known for her experimental archaeology projects, where she painstakingly recreates Roman recipes using instructions and ingredients sourced from the archaeological, written, and pictorial records. Her recreations are published weekly on her food blog, www.tavolamediterranea.com, and have been circulating and shared online by institutions such as the British Museum, the Penn Museum, and Cornell University. Farrell's work has also been covered by Atlas Obscura, Radio New Zealand, and Heritage Radio Network. Buonasera, Farrell. Welcome.
Buonasera. Buonasera, grazie.
Well, your curriculum is very, very impressive. And I've been so curious to meet you and learn more about your work since I think it was on Instagram. I saw your bread stamp, but that will be down the road to the conversation. So Farrell, you are Canadian, right?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit where you're from?
Yeah, I was born in a city called Winnipeg, Manitoba, grew up in Little Italy in Winnipeg, and then I moved to Vancouver in my early 20s, lived most of my adult years there, and then I moved down to the States after I married an Italian-American man. about 10 years ago.
Okay, and so you're now located in Malibu, is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. And at some point, whether it was already your course of studies or maybe you were just a little girl and you decided that you were going to become an archaeologist.
So my stepfather was actually integral in planting that seed into my head. As a child, he would take us to the local museum, the Manitoba Museum of Man and Nature, and we would look at our own cultural roots and the dioramas in the museum, and they had these recreated arrowheads in the shop, and my dad would always read us articles about archaeology and history, and he is an avid historian. And so he started us, my sister and I, down this path. And then, of course, in 1981, I think it was, Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, and he took us to see Raiders, and that was it. It blossomed from there, and I was very interested in it for a long time. Like some folks that are interested in the humanities, they tend to veer away from it in their 20s. People in your circles tell you to do something smarter, to get a better job, to go into accountancy or law or something like that. And so I didn't actually jump in and get my degree until several years ago. And now that I have, I'm happy. I'm in my element. I'm doing what I love, and I'm contributing and giving something back to the public at the same time.
Indeed, and I think also your thesis or your work has also got you some prizes. Wonderful. So what is the course of study of someone that wants to become an archaeologist? And does everyone sees excavating a site as the ultimate goal, or some others go just into research? Or tell us a little bit about the different areas.
So, plan of attack, basically, the way that I went about it was that I got a general degree in archaeology to begin with, but I had always been specializing in my head in food and food waste. And I always found a way to drive subjects back to food, because for me, food is very important. I mean, and you would know that as well, Viviana, in our day, how much food drives us and how much food is a part of our family. It's a part of our emotion. It's a part of our experiences. It's tethered to like our grandparents and to our mothers. And so food is much more than just something that you eat to sustain you. It's so complex, and it connects to so many other areas of archaeology, or the study of human behavior. And so I got my degree, but I kept moving it towards the study of food, cooking, food preparation, food production, some consumption, some agriculture. And then when I moved on into my master's, I zeroed in on it quite heavily, particularly in the classical Mediterranean. And of course, beginning with Roman food, but then zeroing in on breads, because to me, Greco-Roman breads are so complex, so beautiful, so symbolic, and they overlap between many spheres in life: the religious, the commercial, and the domestic. And so for me, it's quite interesting to study that, to learn about how bread is made in different classes of society, how it's consumed, whether it's offered or whether it's eaten, and then to watch it move from the pagan realm eventually into the Christian realm as well. So that's generally the path that I took to get to where I was. And then of course it one of the most pivotal points was working at Monte Testaccio in Rome.
Okay, so we'll get to talk about those experiences and the project at Monte Testaccio. Was it the first project that you participated in Italy? And for those who are not Romans, if you can explain what Monte Testaccio is and actually what it's made of, because that's usually what people go and photograph. And so what's the significance of Monte Testaccio in Rome?
Okay, so in your last question, you were talking about excavation and other ways to do archaeology, and Monte Testaccio is a beautiful example of excavation for the purposes of studying commerce and trade in ancient Rome. You could take other paths if you want, and you can do non-invasive archaeology like ground penetrating radar or aerial survey. There's lots of ways to do it. Monte Testaccio was a quote unquote invasive project, right? Which means you're breaking ground, you're excavating, and you are essentially destroying portions of the site at the same time, but studying that which you are taking out in a methodical manner. And so the project was underway for a good 30 years under the University of Barcelona and Dr. Ramasal. And so I worked as a volunteer on the project, and I did what I was told, and I watched and I learned. And for me, it was every day was just a dream, because you're studying not just ceramics, but you're looking at the marks that are on the ceramics in order to study the trade of olive oil in the first 250 years of the empire. So what Monte Testaccio is in central Rome, or in the Aventine, in what was once the most busy food distribution area of Rome between Trastevere and Aventino. It's a man-made hill comprised entirely of potsherds, broken up pieces of ceramics from amphorae that were strictly used for containing olive oil and shipping olive oil all over the Mediterranean. But in this case, with Monte Testaccio, it's coming mainly from Spain or Hispania Baetica, and then a portion of it, about 15%, is coming from Tunisia, from North Africa. So the hill is a testimony to olive oil consumption in Rome. And we're fortunate to have this hill to study because the ceramic amphorae contained olive oil, you couldn't reuse it. So it was a single-use vessel, because the olive oil would eventually go rancid on the inside and it would stink and it was unhealthy. So you couldn't use it to contain wine, or you couldn't use it to contain water. You could use it for wall fill. So some of these broken pieces of the amphora are found in construction contexts, but the majority of them are either on the bottom of the Tiber or on this hill in the Aventine. And so what the archaeologists are studying with these amphorae is they're looking mainly for stamps that are on the handles of the vessels. And the stamps indicate where the olive oil was made. And then titoli picti or dipinti, painting, graffiti that was painted on the exterior, the body of the amphora, would say how much was in the vessel. It would have a consular signature on it that could allow us to date the vessel. And so then they could date the portion of the hill where it came from. So it's just brilliant, right? But it speaks mainly to commerce and trade. So you can model olive oil trade all over the Mediterranean, but it doesn't speak to the taste of the olive oil. It doesn't speak to whether it was used for lamp fuel or to clean the skin or in cooking or to dress foods. It only speaks to trade in the Mediterranean region, right? So while I worked on that project, I was completely enamored with the fact that you could model olive oil trade, but I wanted to know what happened to it once it left the Oreum or the Orea, the warehouses along the Tiber. Where did it go in the homes? How was it used in the kitchens? Were they using it for their lamps? Were they using it with strigils to clean their skin? Was it cheap garbage olive oil, or was it beautiful? And those were the things that I was curious about. I was curious about whether it was bitter and punchy or if it was bland, and what role it played in the kitchens of average Romans.
Okay, and I'm sure also the technology, that is available now has done huge strides in comparison with something that was maybe available 60, 70 years ago to detect and go deeper into this research. Now, this is a question that I just came to mind because obviously we see pictures of an archaeologist working not only from videos, but also the movies. When something is indeed unearthed, what are some of the immediate steps that the team takes to secure that object? Because obviously, if you dig out on a site, the quantity of fragments is probably big. So, what are some of like the 1, 2, 3 must do as soon as something is unearthed?
So just specifically within the case of Monte Testaccio, for example, when you were digging up ceramic potsherds as opposed to human remains, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ceramic potsherds, they're prioritized in that case by rim sherds or body sherds. The body sherds are the great big chunks of ceramic that you see pouring from the terraces along the nightclubs that line the outside of the hill that gets swept into the alley every night. The rim sherds are the ones that are valued because they have a physical characteristic or a stamp or dipinti on it that are usable for the research.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, initially when they bring them out of the ground, obviously the first thing that Dr. Masal and his team would do is they would spot a specific area of the hill. You would survey it. You would put in your points to indicate, you know, the sea level, the location, because the key aspect is the context that it was removed from, the stratigraphy, where it was in the hole that it came out of, because you're able to map then what portion of the hill was built when, like at what portion between 0 and 250 AD did they put specific sherds in this one area. And then, so what they would do was, you know, the first thing you would do is clean the sherds. You would wash them very, very carefully in a bath of water and citric acid to remove any organic materials. There was lye. There's a lot of lye on the sherds that were put on by the Romans in order to diminish smell, which you have to, you know, you have to think about these sensory aspects of that as well, is that they had the wherewithal to know, okay, this hill of olive oil soaked potsherds is stinky. We got to put something on it to reduce the smell. And so you have to take the lye off as well, and then look for any indications of stamps or dipinti on the front of it, and then they would reconstruct it and then log all of the graffiti, dipinti, and stamps, and that would go into CPAC's main database, which is a work of art in my opinion, because that's how they're modeling the trade. But they also allow students access to the database for their own papers. So if you're looking at one specific area of olive oil production, you can request access and they'll give you temporary access, and you can study and look at all of the stamps and look at the locations and whatnot. So it's a brilliant project.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much for sharing the process with us. Now, from Rome, we're going to move to Pompeii, because that is going to be also the focus of some of the conversation and some of the research and what you have been doing in the last few years. So when we talk about Pompeii, how much of the site has been excavated, and how much do you think can be still excavated? I mean, just recently in the last couple of years, I think some more thermopolia came out. So what we see, which is already extensive, what percentage is what Pompeii is?
So there, okay, the last figure that I recall is there's 66 hectares and 49 have been excavated. I'd say it's maybe a little bit more, maybe 50 around about now. So what is that? 66, 49, 30, 25, 30%, something like that, remains to be excavated. And when I think about it, it just makes my heart beat because I think about, oh my God, what could be there? Because I mean, finding the Popina last year was, or sorry, in 2020 was just a taste of what's to come if they continue further eastwards in that northeast corner, where there's so much left to be excavated. And I can't imagine what's underneath there. And I just pray that there's a bakery or 5.
So, well, in your opinion, based on your studies and the images depicted, whether it's in the Thermopolia or somewhere else, can you give us a little bit an idea of what people were eating at that time? Whether it was more based on grains or if they had game, whether anything that you can tell us about some of the popular foods of those times.
Okay. It's a big question that'll take a long time to answer, but what I can do is I can zero in on kind of one particular subject, which that Popina helped us zero in a little bit closer on, so speaking of grains and speaking of access to meat, okay, is a long standing debate in Roman food archaeology. And one of the things that you see published the most and gets bandied about a lot is this understanding or a assumption that the working class and the poor of Rome didn't have access to meat. They had largely vegetarian diets, and that the wealthy and the elite had all the access to the meat. But what the Popina did was it helped us to see that perhaps that assumption is incorrect, because we see the frescoes that are on the outside of that bank that might not be the case, but it's interpreted to suggest that because Rome was largely illiterate, that these animals indicated what was for sale in this Popina, with exception to the dog, of course. And then you also have what they had, the archaeologists had excavated, it described the remains of lipids and some remains of, what was it, snail shells, duck fat, fish bones, I want to say, was it goat? I can't remember, but there was animal remains, but quite a strange combination in one of the dolium that were inside, that are fixed inside of the hearth of that Popina, right? Which is why, so when I wrote my piece about it for Atlas Obscura a year and a half ago, my opinion was that this might have actually represented either the remains of a master stock or garbage, or it was a waste heap. But what it told us, though, essentially was that Popine, or these stew houses, which were kind of like on every corner in Pompeii and Rome, were actually serving meat, and they were serving different types of seafood, and they were serving poultry and whatnot, and duck. And these places were frequented by the working class, and they were poo-pooed by the elite. You wouldn't want to be caught dead in a place like that if you were well-to-do or of the patrician class. So that instantly dispelled this assumption that the poor couldn't access meat. So that brought this conversation back onto the table, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the possibility that they actually had more access to meat and seafood than we had previously assumed. And then going to greens. So one of my publications that's coming out shortly is discussing this subject, that the poor, or that Romans in general, had a diet that was largely comprised of grain. The most recent figure, or the most communicated, is 70% grain calories in the daily diet of Romans, and that's been it was proposed by Lynn Foxhall in the 80s, and then it's been communicated since by other archaeologists. So I'm going to be looking at that and debating it a little bit in a future publication, because I like to believe, and the evidence shows, that Romans actually had access to other foods as well. It wasn't that dire a situation where it was just grain and vegetables and then meat for the wealthy. There was much more diversity in their diet.
Yes, thank you. You answered my next question, which was, if we were to take this analysis further, can we assume, can we elaborate more about what foods people had access to based on the place they occupied in society? But you have already addressed that. So in some of the videos I had came across of you in Pompeii, one of the first fascinations that you had were with the meals. Can you describe to us what they look like and why you found them so fascinating?
They're they're a thing of beauty. They really are. And so for the when you go to Pompeii or Ostia for the first time and you see these massive hourglass shaped rotary mills in a bakery, it catches you off guard at first because they're very majestic. They're large, they're static, but they're complex, and they've got this kind of belt around them with square notches in them that you understand would have had something that it would have gone into it at a certain point. And so it immediately invokes curiosity. So the first time that I saw one, I can't remember if it was Pompeii or Ostia where I saw it for the first time.
Okay, I think Austria, I don't know. When I visited Austria, I felt that it was even bigger than Pompeii.
They are.
I had that impression.
There's the one bakery at Ostia that is massive, and even the oven is massive. And when you consider its proximity to Rome, and its proximity to the river, you can imagine how much flour is actually being milled in that place. Never mind bread, but the flour being sent upriver as well. But the mills themselves they're beautiful. David Peacock tells us that they're made of leucitite, which is a volcanic material. The majority of them are coming from the Orvieto region. In Pompeii, some of them are Vesuvian, their material, their makeup. And they were powered by donkeys or horses. Some folks have communicated that they were powered by human labor. That would be very, very difficult. You would have sciatica by the end of the day. You would have back problems. Maybe the smaller ones, the smaller mills could have been, not the large ones though, which is why we see some sculptural representations or images of somebody, a man coaxing a donkey around, or beating a donkey. The golden ass Apuleius also describes what that type of scenario was like. So it was mainly powered by donkeys or horses. The hopper at the top of the mill would be filled with grain, and it would be cracked between the hourglass portion of it, which is called the catalyst, sits on top of the stationary meta, and it's turned around, cracking the grain that comes through the top, and then it spills out the bottom into a catch pan that's around the base of the mill.
So after your fascination with the mills, probably you're imagining everything that was going around the mills. Then the subsequent step was indeed a passion for bread. In general, besides your work, what does bread mean to you? It looks like you have a propensity that bread is more, again, than just food. So maybe something related also to your family and how you grew up, or maybe watching someone at home making bread.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think bread for all of us should be something that is very meaningful, because it's essentially the first thing that we made. It's the first thing that we learned how to do. And bread can be made of any form of starch, whether it's grain or potato starches or bean starches, whatever. We learned how to process starch as early humans and produce it into some form of a mash and a cake. And then our skills and our manipulation of these starches changed over time to become something as quote unquote sophisticated as it is now. And I don't really think it's sophisticated. I think it's second nature to humans to be able to know how to make bread. And it's the staff of life. It's something that we have valued, maybe not so much in recent years, maybe not in the last 200 years, but it used to be something that it was daily. We made our bread daily. It was largely produced by women. It was the role of women to mill and to crack grain and to make bread every day. It was so important to us for millennia that it was something that we offered to the gods. It was a product of our annual harvest. And it sustained us. It's, starch and carbs and energy and calories, and it's something that kept us alive for millennia. And so in recent years, I find it fascinating because I look at the role of bread in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and how valued it was to them. They valued it enough to paint it in frescoes, to put it into sculptural representations, to write about it, and how to make it into an offering for the gods, and to give it to the gods as something that would please them. And then in modern society, we see it become something insignificant. And it's troubling to me to see that, particularly in North America, to see it, after the industrialization of grain growing and bread making, it becomes something that's cheap, it's expendable, we can let it mold on our counter and throw half of it away and we don't care about it. Whereas my grandmother would be mortified if you let your bread go off on the counter and you didn't eat it, because she herself worked a lot. She worked hard to make her bread as well. And that's one of my, most treasured memories. And one of my favorite memories of her is just being in her kitchen, watching her working, making bread on the table, just very plain whole wheat bread that she would cut for us and put some cheese on it, wrap it in wax paper, very simple stuff, but it was valuable, and it was something that she valued and we valued it. And so for me to go back and to study it 2000 years ago is like taking it back to a time when it was valued again and where it was critical, and it was such an important part of the Roman diet. And clearly they appreciated it. Clearly they knew the value of it. I mean, Rome expanded for the purpose of procuring more land and more food and more grain.
Mm-hmm.
And to bring all that grain in, to process it into bread, was critical to the survival of Rome. And so bread plays an integral part of that. And then, of course, it's also an integral part of the religion, of Roman religion.
Yes. And we have seen kind of the resurgence of bread making just in the last 2 years, because it's understandable that during COVID, people felt similarly to a situation of famine, or when you are, under attack, so to speak, where you're concerned about your own survival. So people really wanted to take this skill, whether it was bread making, pasta making, and that's why we're short of flour and yeast. But again, it brought a culture of bread back, maybe even artistic type of bread, but it's very interesting. Now you had the great fortune to study the loaves, some of the carbonized loaves from Pompeii. Can you tell us what they look like and what your findings were, if there was something on these loaves? And then maybe we can talk about the bakeries, if you have any idea of what the bakeries could have looked like in those times.
Sure. So my findings in particular are going to be coming out in a Bloomsbury publication very shortly. So okay, I'll be happy to, I'll let you know as soon as, they're my specific findings, right? But I can discuss kind of the general observations about the loaves. And what excited me about them and what intrigued me about them was their form, because they're so complex. And just the shape of them, the pre-segmented wedges, and then the belt line. Of course, the belt line is the most complex aspect of it, and that's primarily the reason why I started studying them, was to look at their form and its relation to the loaf's function and production, right? So on my site years ago, I already theorized that I felt that the belt line was in place. That's what I believe to be cord. It has to be something that's kept in place to keep the bread from expanding while it bakes. Because as we know, when you bake bread, it rises in the oven, particularly when it's leavened. So when you're a commercial bakery in Rome and you have a specific output and amount of loaves that you want to get out every day to feed Rome or to feed Pompeii, you need to maximize your floor capacity in your oven. So you do that by allowing the loaves to rise upwards, not sideways. And that requires restriction along the horizon of the loaf. So I theorized that that belt line is evidence for the restriction of horizontal expansion of the loaves in order to get that extra 2 or 3 loaves in on the floor, right? And then it also, of course, makes it easier to carry the loaf, whether you're a buyer or a hawker. When the Popina was excavated in December 2020, most people didn't notice, but my eye went to it straight away, was the fresco of the porter on, you see one of the quadrants on the bank, on the bar, it's got a bunch of amphorae and some glasswares that's on the counter. There's a porter with a pole. And as we know from one other sculptural representation on one of the walls of, it's at Via degli Augustali, and just outside the Forum is 2 men with a pole with 2 amphorae on it. And so we know that foodstuffs were run around Rome using poles. And so that kind of furthered my theory that cords were used to tie the belt line on these loaves. Because if you're going to take it to the market or the macellum, or you're going to take it to the restaurants that have purchased them, you need a pole to run it through the streets. So looking at the form, and then, on some of them, not at Pompeii, not the remains that are at Pompeii, but at Herculaneum, you see stamps that are on some of these loaves as well. And previous scholars have theorized, and I think accurately so, that the stamp has to do with the buyer. So if you are bringing your unbaked loaf to the oven to be baked, because you don't have an oven in your own home, which was very common in urban settings in ancient Rome, approximately 50% of people didn't have cooking or baking facilities, which necessitated these popina and bakeries. You'd need to stamp that that was your loaf, right? Or some scholars have also theorized that perhaps grain was even kept in bakeries. So you would drop off a quantity of grain to the baker. They would say, okay, you've got X amount, so many kilos of grain. We'll make bread with it and we'll take a cut for our labor. But you still need to know this is your loaf. We made it with your grain. So the stamps had everything to do with the buyer, is what's commonly understood.
Does this type of bread have a specific name?
Well, the name that we used to communicate or to describe the loaf is the Panis Quadratus, but it's not called that in ancient writing. It is called, so there's 3 instances where it is written about and described. There's Hesiod, and then there's Athenaeus and Philostratus, who describe it as 8-part bread. So 8-part bread, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's our loaf of bread right there. And then in Greek, it's quadratoi, quadratids, which then is translated to plural quadrated or quadratids in quadrated ones in English. But that essentially simply just describes the loaves that are sectioned into 4, which is what you see. You see a lot of sculptural representations of those early, those late Republican, early imperial loaves that are just pre-segmented into 4, but then they're also made into 6, and they're also made into 8. So it's an umbrella description for the loaves that are impressed with lines to pre-segment them so you can just break them apart.
Okay. And when we talk about the ingredients, can we narrow down some of the ingredients of this type of bread? And do you think it maybe was more nutritional than the bread that we're eating now, or if you can draw some similarities or differences? And then we will move into your experiments, what you have been doing successfully. So anything that you can tell us about maybe some of the ingredients that Roman bread contained?
So I rely strictly on archaeology and the written record to find out what the ingredients are that I use for my experiments. So with respect to the 81 loaves of bread that were found in the bakery of Modestus at Pompeii, the only grain remains that were found in that bakery were triticum aestivum, so just basic common bread wheat. It wasn't spelt, it wasn't barley, it was triticum aestivum. So with my experiments, I always use common bread wheat. But then the written record also tells us that these types of loaves also contained poppy seeds, parsley, fennel. Pliny the Elder also tells us that git was grown for use in bakeries. And so git is Roman coriander, which we also call Nigella sativa in the modern era, or it's the scientific name for it. So that tells us, oh, they weren't just plain breads, they had herbs and all sorts of wonderful additives. So those particular items I look at as used in these particular quadrated loaves, strictly because they're related to bakeries. And then the grain that was found in the Pompeian bakery was common bread wheat. So that's what I work with the most.
Okay, and I'm sure the bakeries were also maybe sitting next to other establishments, maybe the staples, and there might be some not planned ingredients that might still have added in additional flavoring. Now let's talk about your four best friends, Daryl Romano, Epiteos Kentuck, and Angelo. Who are they? And where are they? Where are you keeping them?
Oh, that's so great. Yeah, my starters, my children. Aside from my dogs, Salvatore, Nino, and Enzo, are my other babies is so Daryl Romano. Angelo is my first starter, and he's named after my friend Angelo in Rome.
Is they do not touch, right?
Yeah, he and I used to make a lot of pizza together. And so I named my first starter after Angelo. And so, but then Angelo was he was hybrided with, not hybrided, that's not a word. He was hybridized with Canadian flour and another starter that I had. So I made him a Canadian Italian kid, which you would have to have a Canadian name like Daryl, which is kind of like a hoser name. So Daryl Romano is an Italian last name, but a Canadian first name. Papitius is a starter that I created in Pompeii, and I took him with me to work. So granted, I took him with me to work, and I just popped him open, and I sat him in the mills while I was surveying the bakeries and measuring the ovens and everything. And again, I'm not trapping any wild yeasts and making him strictly Pompeian, because the air at Pompeii is modern air. The wild yeast is modern wild yeast. The wild yeasts on my hands are modern, and in the air in my kitchen is modern. But for me, it was something that from the heart I felt would be fun to do. And at least he would have some of the Pompeian juju on him, and that Papitius was named after Papitius Priscus, who was one of the main bakers at Pompeii, who had a very large bakery located in Region 7. And so that's where he came from. And then Marcus Attilius, he's my favored son. He's my number one. He is the starter that I created using Pliny the Elder's evidence to suggest that some starters were created using cicerchia or chickling vetch. And for me, that was absolutely fascinating and quite the experiment, quite the project, because fermenting peas at first I thought, well, this is going to be interesting, right? And it took, I don't know, about maybe a week to get him up and running, and then topping him up with barley. But it turned out to be one of the most like just outrageous sourdough starters that I've ever had. He works at half the time. It's you feed him and he just like he's ready to go in a couple of hours. I've never had a starter that's that aggressive and that hardworking. So I use him for everything now. My gold belly recipes, everything gets made with Marcus Attilius. And then I'll spike him every couple, twice a year. I'll spike him with additional fermented tzatziki or chickling vetch to feed him and get him back up again.
Yes. So just to make sure, the breads and recreations that Farrell does for us indeed have historical relevance. So what were the main difficulties in recreating the recipes? And again, maybe can you tell us about the steps, and then at some point later on we can link up to some of the demonstrations you have done for Atlas Obscura that is very fantastic. So what are maybe some of the instruments also that either the Romans were using or something that you had to recreate as we currently use Dutch ovens and things like that? So walk us through your process of recreating a loaf.
Okay, so depending on what I'm studying and what I'm hypothesizing or what the outcome will be, I try to work as closely as possible to the original technologies. It's impossible. The hurdles that present themselves are that I can't use any of these volcanic rotary mills at Pompeii to see what the quality of the grain is like when it comes out. The other hurdles that present themselves are that we know that sieves were used to bolt the flour to a certain fineness, but we don't have any evidence of them. So we don't know the gauges that were being used. So we don't know the fineness of the flour. We don't know what fineness the bakeries were trying to achieve. Were they working, towards maximum output, one single bolting, or were they actually doing it 3 times to get a very fine product? We don't know. So what I do is I experiment with various qualities of flour, and then I work backwards essentially by constructing the loaves, working with various hydrations based on studying the loaves themselves at the Man, and then based on things that Pliny the Elder says about, hydration levels for certain types of grain, or the best wheat, which we can assume perhaps might be North African wheat, like Alexandrian or North African. And then knowing as a baker, applying my skills as a baker, knowing that the impressions can only maintain themselves if you're dealing with a specific hydration. So then I study that, I make the loaves, and then I carbonize them in my oven outside. And so I experiment with different temperatures, carbonize them, study the crumb. I take into key consideration the temperature of the pyroclastic surges during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and the fact that the interior of the oven, the temperature would be less because it was insulated from those surges. So you're looking at a thermal impact on the loaves that is less than the thermal impact on human beings and wood and structures that are outside of the ovens. So that's one of the critical aspects of my experiments that I'll be writing about, that's actually being published in the next couple of months. And that has been critical to my understanding of the composition of the loaves, the size of the loaves, etc. And again, knowing that in order for those loaves to hold their impressions, they would have had to have been really, really dense and of really low hydration.
Mhm. Obviously, you know, the recipes that you have for your search is one thing. You have also, I believe, shared a recipe for Panis Quadratus, but you also make the Panis Quadratus available, right? You in your own bakery. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your link between your panis and back to giving back to
Sure.
Pompeii?
Sure, absolutely. So I started this year. I started an online bakery called Bistrinum by Tavola Mediterranea, and it's available through Goldbelly. It's to help me fund my PhD, and but the Panis Quadratus, which I make, which is very popular. Um, what I do with it is I produce it for sale, but all of the proceeds go straight back to Pompeii, which they should, because this is Pompeian cultural heritage. And so it goes back to a youth charity in Pompeii called Forum dei Giovani, which is for youth work experience and youth volunteer initiatives in Pompeii and Scapati. And so every loaf that is sold goes right back to the source of the archaeology and the cultural heritage.
Mhm. Wow, that's fantastic. I mean, your work is being embraced right away because here it is a juncture between, you know, it's a cross-disciplinary junction between food-related archaeology, modern culinary food culture. You have the foodies, you have the chefs, and people that are really growing a deeper interest in finding out the origins of the food that they work with in ancient food preparation. Now, when we talk a little bit about your grandmother that you would never see her wasting any bread. And that's the same thing at my father's house.
Mm.
He always wanted us to write an essay about the breadcrumb, starting from La Briciola, you know, because it explains
Oh,
the
beautiful.
cycle of life. Do you find that Rome, this very eccentric city, was wasteful in their food ways or parsimonious?
Oh, Romans did not waste their food because they couldn't afford to, because famine was always around the corner.
Mhm.
And that's the most beautiful thing about studying Roman food archaeology is every little piece got used. And so, I mean, you can read Apicius, for example, the Recocunaria, and see examples of how every part of the animal is used when they make offale or offal.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, we can look at modern, not so modern, but modern Italian cuisine and see the uses of stale bread in panzanella and different types of food offerings like that, where you can see the remains of ancient or even medieval Italian food culture in modern Italian foods. And waste is not an option. And that's what I admire so much about Italian cuisine and Roman cuisine is it teaches us the value of food and not to waste it. And to see, I mean, bread is a perfect example. You can use stale bread to make bread pudding. You can use it to make salad, right? Panzanella. And I'll never understand why in North America we waste such a high amount of food. I don't understand where it comes from. It might have to do with our disconnection from our food supply, and I don't see that in continental Europe. I don't see that in Italy. Italians care so much about their food. Watching Italians shop for their dinner after work is a beautiful thing to behold. Seeing their food being used in the kitchens, their ability to cook is something that's not quite on par in North America, and that's why I enjoy studying it the way that I do. There's so much to learn from it, and there's so much joy in it, and happiness, and family, and home, and togetherness. And maybe if we did a little bit more of that, if we kind of changed our trajectory just a little bit in North America with respect to food, we might have some of that joy come back. And I think that's what happened during the pandemic. That's what I think happened. I think that when we all retreated into our kitchens and we all learned how to make sourdough, there was it was a response to stress and panic
Mhm.
where everybody went back into their kitchens. But I also think that we went back in time a little bit. We ran to our grandmothers.
Mhm.
and held onto their aprons
Yes.
because they were terrified, right? And we made bread because that's the first comfort that we saw as children. But I like to think that that's also in our blood somewhere as well, that that is retreating in history to a place of comfort and a place of commonality and something that we all share. And it was a response, it was a coping mechanism, a response to complete panic.
Thank you very much. And with this great image, it is time for us to say arrivederci alla prossima. And we want to thank you for tuning in to the program. If you have any questions or comments, you can contact us at theitalianradiohour@gmail.com. We would like to hear from you. And remember, if you or any of your family and friends have missed a prior episode or would like to listen to this episode again, please visit our website at www.istitutomonditaliano.org and click on the Italian Radio Hour tab. Vorremmo ringraziare la nostra ospite Farrell Monaco, il nostro sponsor Istituto Mondo Italiano e alla Boara per la musica. And finally, before we leave, here is our trivia question for next week. What does Dio li fa e poi li accoppia mean? So here is Dio li fa e poi li accoppia. You can send in your answers at theitalianradiohour@gmail.com. And if you're not living in the Pittsburgh area or might be out of town, remember you can catch us streaming live at khbradio.com every Thursday at 5 o'clock. And be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at the Italian Radio Hour. Until next time, alla prossima. Ciao, ciao.
Grazie.